Hello and welcome to the Murders at Karlov Manor Mechanics and Draft Archetype Overview. With Murders at Karlov Manor releasing very soon, February 9th to be exact, and the pre release coming up even sooner than that on February 2nd, it's important to know what mechanics and archetypes to look for in the new set as we return to the plane of Ravnica for this classic whodunit expansion. So we start off our archetype overview with a brand new creature type and tribal archetype with the Azorius Detectives. So the detective creature type can be added to pretty much anything from homunculus, spirits, even humans, anything that Ravnica has to offer. And we get our detective lord in Private Eye, the signpost card for Azorius in Murder at Karlov Manor. And then whenever you draw your second card each turn, one of your detectives can't be blocked. So you definitely look for all these detective types to load into your deck, and they kind of feature this evasion with either unblockable or with phantom gaining flying whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield. And a lot of your detectives you see are going to be some of these lower powered creatures. And so that's what the Azorius Detectives deck is going to look for, is a lot of smaller creatures to kind of flood the board, gain this evasion, and then swing in to solve the case. But how are you going to draw all these extra cards? Well, you might remember that Ravnica featured clue tokens. And the Dimir archetype is really going to focus on these clue tokens in a more control shell. So Curious Cadaver, our signpost for the Dimir deck, once again has flying, that nice evasion you see on this zombie detective. And whenever you sacrifice a clue, you can return Curious Cadaver to your hand. How do you get these clue tokens? Through the returning mechanic of Investigate. Select a card like Deduce in the Dimir control deck, or even in the Detectives deck. Draw a card, investigate, create that clue. You can then sacrifice that clue token to draw a card. And so we see on cards like Persuasive Interrogators for the Dimir deck, whenever it enters the battlefield, you investigate. Investigate means that you create this clue token, which you can then pay 2 mana and sacrifice to draw a card. For the Detectives deck for Azorius, drawing that card will likely be your second one per turn. All of your detective effects will trigger. You can swing in for evasion. With your Dimir deck, whenever you sacrifice a clue, generally you're going to have other effects that go along with that. For example, with Interrogators here, because it's a Gorgon detective, whenever you sacrifice a clue, you give your opponent 2 poison counters. And if we remember, once you get up to 10 poison counters on your opponent, they lose the game. So, as well as being a card advantage engine through those clue tokens, it's also going to be one of your big finishers if you can create a critical amount of clues. Rakdos, on the other hand, looks at the flip side of the coin. Rather than detectives, we are looking at suspects. So the signpost card Runebrand Juggler, whenever it enters the battlefield, you can suspect a creature that you control. What this means is that that creature gains menace and can't block. So basically, you're looking at a down, low to the ground aggro deck for Rakdos in Murders at Karlov Manor. In addition to creating suspected creatures, Rakdos then lets you sacrifice those suspected creatures to murder something. Basically, a creature gains -5/-5 till end of turn. Not very many creatures in the format are going to survive that. Uh, And then you can get other cards in your deck to look for, like Repeat Offender, who either suspect themselves or grow bigger while they're suspected, or other effects that deal with this suspect mechanic. And so these kind of suspect interactions are what your Rakdos deck is going to look for. Gruul, however, goes a different way. Rather than being suspected, they try to disguise themselves. And so this is going to be another new mechanic in Murders of Karlov Manor. So our signpost card, Tin Street Gossip, is able to add 2 mana to our mana pool to cast face down spells or turn creatures face up, which is what our disguise mechanic does. You can cast a card face down for 3 mana if it has disguise, and it's going to be disguised as this 2/2 creature with Ward 2. And then at any point you can turn it face up for its disguise cost, in this case of 5 mana. And then usually it's going to have some other effect along with just being a large body. So this mechanic might sound very familiar, and those familiar with the morph mechanic, it is extremely similar. You cast your card face down for 3, just like you would with morph. The upside being that with disguise, it also gains that ward 2 to make it so much harder to interact with. And then with this rule archetype, you're going to be looking for the disguise on these big bodies that you can ramp into to really just kind of swing in with a 2/2. Oh, it's only 2 damage, no big deal. And then you reveal the disguise, and oh, it's a 6/7, you're dead. And so that's what you got to watch for with this Gruul deck um, and these disguise creatures. Selesnya also is working with the disguise mechanic, um, but in a more value way. Yes, you've got the bigger creatures like Culvert Ambusher, which is a 4/5 instead of a 2/2. But when you reveal the disguise on this one, you force a creature to block. There's other ones that have naturalize effects, or the signpost card, or whenever a face down card is turned face up, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and so does Sumala Sentry. And so you see, Selesnya really wants to get these disguise cards in there. You're going to want to look for a lot of the cheap ones. So Culvert Ambusher is a good top end, but you're really going to want to look for more of the cheaper disguise cards that you can flip over multiples in a turn, or flip them over while still being able to put more down. And so that's what you're going to be looking for or looking at in the Selesnya archetype. Orzhov, once again, focuses on the disguise mechanic. However, they don't really care about revealing the disguise. Orzhov likes to stay more in the shadows. So we see things like Wisp Drinker Vampire, their signpost card, cares about creatures with power 2 or less entering the battlefield. So anytime that happens, you can leech a life off of your opponent. Now, the disguise creatures of note enter the battlefield as the morph or as the disguise. So they enter as a 2/2 with Ward 2. So even a card like Museum Nightwatch, who has 3 power naturally, if you cast it for its disguise, the 3 mana to put it in, it enters the play as a 2/2, triggers Wisp Drinker Vampire. Late game, Wisp Drinker has the mana sink in there to pay 7 and give everything Death Touch and Lifelink. Once again, only creatures with power 2 or less. So if you have revealed the disguise on any of your cards, then they might not get hit by it. But once again, that morph side, that face down side, is going to be more beneficial on the Orzhov plan. And if they go to kill your morph creature, then you reveal the disguise, say, oh, you're killing Museum Nightwatch. Guess what? Now I get a 2/2 white and blue detective token. which is also another 2-power creature entering the battlefield for Mistdrink or Vampire. And so those are the kind of tricks and mechanics you're going to look for in an Orzhov deck. Izzet, on the other hand, doesn't really care really what's going on. They don't care about detectives. They don't care about suspects. Izzet cares about their artifacts. Now, what's the best way to get artifacts in this set? Well, probably by investigating, like the Izzet Signpost card Detective Satchel does twice when it enters the battlefield. And so then you get these double clue tokens that you can then use to draw cards or create other effects. Because Izzet in this set not only wants artifacts, but wants to sacrifice artifacts. And clue tokens just do that naturally. So with Detective Satchel, not only will you draw the card from sacrificing your clue token, but you will also get a Thopter artifact creature token with flying. Now you can only activate that if you sacrifice an artifact this turn, but if you load your deck up with these investigate triggers, then you'll definitely have plenty of clues to sacrifice that will then draw you into more investigate. Um, and then you've got cards you can put in also like Crime Novelist. Whenever you sacrifice an artifact, aka a clue token, put a +1 counter on Crime Novelist, get yourself 1 red mana that you can then cast your next investigate spell, crack your next clue token, and just keep the deck chaining. And so that's really what you want to look for in your Izzet deck is a bunch of clue interactions, um, like Novelist, like Satchel, and the investigate cards to go with it. Simic gives us uh, another very different, although still seemingly familiar mechanic in collect evidence. So evidence examiner comes down on 2, and then at the beginning of combat, you may collect evidence. What that means is you exile cards with total mana value of whatever that collect is, um, or greater from your graveyard. So, for example, collect evidence 4, you would want to exile cards with total mana value of 4 from your graveyard. We've seen different exile mechanics like this. I don't know how well this one's going to go because you really have to fill your graveyard, and you need ways to fill your graveyard to fuel this evidence train. But with Evidence Examiner and the Simic deck in general, you're going to have these whenever you collect evidence payouts. So, for example, whenever you collect evidence, investigate. But like we said, you're going to need these ways of filling your graveyard. And one of the best ways of doing that we find here with Topiary Panther is the return of land cyclers. So generally, these land cyclers are going to be big creatures on big bodies that you can play in the late game, as we have seen in the last few sets, with a very cheap cycling ability on them. So in the early game, you can land cycle them, get yourself your forest to play your evidence examiner, and then you've got this 6-drop in the graveyard already that you can collect for evidence to get all of your evidence triggers. And so that's a really neat play that you're going to want to look for in Simic, is just these different ways of filling your graveyard so that you can collect evidence to get these different payouts. Golgari kind of does the same thing in a slightly different way. Um, so the signpost for Golgari is actually not a creature but an enchantment in Insidious Roots, where it gives creature tokens the ability to add mana of any color. This is going to be great ramp. It lets you splash pretty much anything in the set. But more than that, whenever creature cards leave your graveyard, so with the collect evidence, when you're removing these creature cards from your graveyard, you're creating plant creature tokens. These plants, by nature of Insidious Roots, will be able to tap for any mana. But most importantly, with Insidious Roots, you will then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant that you control. So the more cards, the more creature cards you remove from your graveyard for evidence, the more plants you will get and the bigger your plants will get. And so that's really what Golgari is looking to do, to fill their graveyard through mechanics like the returning mechanic of Surveil. Uh, for example, we see here on Snarling Gorehound, whenever a creature power 2 or less enters the battlefield, you get to Surveil 1. Uh, to Surveil, you look at the top card of your library and decide whether you want to keep it on top or put it into your graveyard. If it's a creature with a high enough mana cost that you can discover into evidence, go ahead and throw it in your graveyard. Discover it with evidence, trigger Insidious Roots, get yourself a plant token, grow those plant tokens. Go ahead, fill your graveyard, collect your evidence, and get this big army of plants to just overwhelm your opponent. Speaking of overwhelming your opponent, that is exactly what Boros is trying to do. So our Signpost Meddling Youths is a 4/5 haste for 5, and whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you investigate. So once again, we see that Boros is really wanting to be on the attack, creating a lot of creatures and creature tokens, and then having these on attack triggers. So for Meddling Youths, you investigate, you get this clue token, you sacrifice it, draw a card, cast more creatures, build your board, and keep the pressure on. So you're going to look for cards like Person of Interest. Whenever it enters the battlefield, suspect it so it gains menace. Um, create that 2/2 detective token. So now you've already got 2 creatures on the board that your opponent needs 3 creatures to block. And then you cast Meddling Youth the next turn, attack with all 3, get your clue token, and just really kind of snowball is what this deck is trying to do. And so with the Boros deck, you're going to look for those lower to the ground creatures with attack triggers that create additional tokens, um, and the combat tricks that are going to help them be successful in an aggressive deck. And so that's all 10 of our archetypes, but not all of our mechanics. There are different cycles in this set, such as the cases that you will see in each color. So every color will have a different case in it. This is a lot like the sagas that we've seen before, um, in that it's an enchantment that will normally stick around on the battlefield. Um, so with cases, when they come into play, they generally have that first effect when this case enters the battlefield. For the case of the Gorgon's Kiss, you'll destroy 1 creature that was dealt damage this turn. And then each case will have a requirement to solve it. So to solve this case, you have to put 3 or more creatures into the graveyard from anywhere this turn. It's quite possible, if you just made a huge swing, that you can present and solve this case at the same point. So you attack with a bunch of creatures, at least 3 of them die, not all of your opponent's creatures did. You cast Case of the Gorgon's Kiss. Whichever one of your opponent's creatures survived combat, you can die with its ETB. And then at the beginning of your end step, this case checks to see if it was solved. Because you attacked earlier, 3 or more cards were put into the graveyard because of combat. You could also do this with land cyclers, surveil triggers, anything that fills your graveyard can also help solve this case. But once it's solved, then this final trigger happens, and it becomes a 4/4 Gorgon with Death Touch and Lifelink. And so then each case has their own ETB, their own solve condition, and their own solve effect. And so these different cases are going to provide an interesting byplay within the game, like a little sub game that not only are you trying to attack and defeat your opponent, but you're also trying to solve these cases while you do it. And that just seems really fun. Another returning mechanic in Murders at Karlov Manor are going to be these split cards. So you get cards like Fuss and Bother. They're all going to have split mana symbols in one of the 10 archetypes. And so you can do it either in a red-white deck a blue-white deck, or just anything that runs one of those colors, because all of the mana cards, all of the mana symbols are going to be these split mana symbols that you can spend with either white or red. And so you really kind of get this byplay between the different guilds of Ravnica on these cards. I really like that they did the split costs on them. It makes these cards a lot more versatile that you can put in a lot more decks, and so you'll really see them shine. So you don't have to be Boros to use Fuss. You could be Selesnya and use Fuss. You could be Izzet and run Bother. You get those 3 artifact creature tokens. So, I mean, you'll really get to see a lot of the plays and byplays with these split cards. Definitely look out for those. I really want to see these cases in action. I think that's going to be really fun to play with. And so now I'm interested in your take. What do you think are going to be the most fun archetypes, the most fun mechanics to play around with? Um, which draft archetype do you think is going to be the best? Let me know in the comments below. While you're down there, put a like on this video, subscribe to my channel for more content, and I'll see you at Karlov Manor.